Welcome to Quiet Night Chills. Today, we'll talk about a necrophiliac, a cannibal, a pedophile, a murderer. His name is Jeffrey Dahmer, and this is his life story. He was born on May 22, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His parents would describe Jeffrey as a happy kid who loved to run around and play until he had to have a double hernia repaired in his head at age 4 that seemed to trigger a change in him, which over time would only get worse. He became quiet and reserved and wasn't that happy kid they once knew anymore. According to Dr. Eric Hickey in his BuzzFeed Unsolved interview, Jeffrey was already born with a disadvantage from the chemical imbalance in his brain, which was passed down from his parents. One can only assume that the operation he had was the trigger his brain needed to bring it all to life. It was said that Jeffrey's parents both struggled with depression, especially his mom. They would constantly argue and had an overall unstable home life, even for years to come. This certainly affected Jeffrey, who would end up spending a lot of time outside, killing and collecting insects such as butterflies and dragonflies. In 1966, they all moved to Ohio. During this time, his mom was pregnant with a little baby boy. After he was born, Jeffrey was said to keep even more to himself. One night they were all eating dinner together at the table, and Jeffrey starts asking his dad questions about bone preservation. Now, it's worth mentioning that during the past few years, Jeffrey's dad went to school for chemistry and was currently working as a research assistant. Him being away was difficult on Jeffrey because he would be gone for days at a time, and when back, his mom would require a lot of his dad's attention due to her mental health struggles, so Jeffrey missed out on a lot of precious moments with his dad. Well, now at the dinner table, his dad got excited, thinking Jeffrey was showing an interest towards his passion, so he happily starts sharing what he knew with Jeffrey, including different acidic mixtures that would help preserve bones for longer, using the bones of the chicken they were eating for demonstration. Little did Mr. Dahmer know that Jeffrey would use this information to preserve his victims' skulls later on. Fast forward to high school. During this time, it seemed like things had gotten especially difficult for Jeffrey. His classmates at the time reported that he had started drinking, even though he was only 14, and would even bring small bottles at school that he would hide in his jackets. His grades started declining as well. He was now a senior, drinking more than before. At home, his parents had decided they didn't want to fight anymore, even after going to couples therapy, so they got a divorce. His dad, wanting to make things a little easier on them, left the house to avoid future conflict. Little did he know that shortly after, in 1978, his now ex-wife, Jeffrey's mom, after getting custody of the little brother, took him and left as well, leaving Jeffrey in the house alone. There was another area in his life that Jeffrey was struggling with during these years, and that was his sexuality. In high school, he discovered that he was attracted to boys, and it brought him a lot of shame. Dr. Hickey, that I mentioned before, explains that this shame, mixed with his inability to form close bonds with others, was a big motivation for Jeffrey to resort to murders and body preservations to create this bond with others. Jeffrey somehow managed to graduate, and now was home alone with a lot of time in his hands. 4 days before his 19th birthday, he picks up a hitchhiker and brings him home for drinks. They're hanging out, and Jeffrey thought that they were friends now, so then when the guy asked to go home, Jeffrey got really upset. He decides he doesn't want this guy to leave, so he hits him in the head with a dumbbell, instantly killing him. Now you would think that he panicked or was at least scared about what just happened. That wasn't the case. On an interview later on, he recalls that he used this chance of being alone with a body to masturbate to it. The next day, he takes the body, separates it in different pieces, puts it in plastic bags, and buries it in the backyard. A few days pass, and after about a week, he digs up the body, takes a knife, and cuts the flesh, then soaks the remaining parts of the body in an acidic solution so that the rest of the meat would fall off the bones. He then proceeds to break the bones and scatter them in the backyard. 6 weeks had gone by, and one day his dad, with his new fiancée, decides to go check on Jeffrey and see how he was doing. It was only then that they found out that Jeffrey was living alone. Appalled and wanting Jeffrey to do something more with his life, his dad pushes him to go to college. His dad wasn't really well off, but was able to get a loan to pay for Jeffrey's college in full from the jump. In response, Jeffrey only attended college for 3 months and achieved a GPA of 0.65, which for those that don't know is extremely low. It seemed that another pattern in his life was instability. He had a hard time keeping a stable job or even a place to live. At first, Jeffrey did not tell his dad about dropping out of college, but when his dad found out, he encouraged Jeffrey to go to the army so he could do something with his life. Jeffrey agrees and joins the army soon after. He was enlisted as a medical specialist and stationed in Germany. Years later, multiple soldiers came forward and confessed that Jeffrey had drugged and abused them for weeks at a time during their service in Germany. When further research was done, no bodies were found in the areas where Jeffrey was stationed. Not too long after, on March 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for military service due to his excess drinking. He was discharged and offered a free one-way plane ticket to anywhere in the US so he could continue with his life. He uses this plane ticket to move to Miami, Florida, and sends no word to his dad. In Miami, he found a job in a restaurant and was living in an old motel nearby. Unfortunately, being discharged by the military taught him nothing. All the money he was making at the restaurant he used to buy alcohol and fell so behind with paying for his living situation that he got evicted and fired from his job as well due to the drinking. He was now feeling very defeated, and having no other option, he calls his dad and tells him about everything. His dad took him in, but just 10 days later, when out looking for a job, he gets in an accident while driving his dad's car. He was fined and given a 10-day jail sentence due to the high levels of alcohol found in his blood. After this, his father was done. He kicks Jeffrey out and tells him to go live with his grandma. Things seemed to get better for him after moving in with his grandma. She treated him with a lot of love and care, and even later he mentions how much he also cared for her. He set up in the basement and got a job at a blood center. Fitting, I know. In 1982, he starts going to gay bathhouses. Remember, he struggled with developing intimate relationship in his day-to-day life. About his experience in these bathhouses, he recalls getting frustrated because the workers would move and talk too much for his liking, so he started crushing a bunch of sleeping pills, pouring them in their drinks, and raping them. This happened 12 times until his membership got revoked. It was now November 20th, 1987. He was out at a bar where he met a 25-year-old and they hit it off. Jeffrey invites this guy over and together they go to a nearby hotel. Jeffrey recalls that he only intended to drug and rape him, but when he woke up and looked over, the guy was now dead and he didn't know what happened. So now stuck with his body and not knowing what to do, he stuffs him in a luggage and brings him to his grandma's house. He leaves the body in the luggage. Remember, he lives in the basement, then returns, chops up the body, and discards everything but the skull. He really wanted to keep the skull. So he mixes up acidic solutions, but the skull became too brittle from being soaked in bleach and breaks. So he really got it in his head that he wanted another one. 2 months later, he meets a 14-year-old sex worker and asks him to come over so he could take pictures of him in exchange of money. He promised that they would not engage in any sexual activities, but unfortunately, that was not the case. They do end up having sex, and then shortly after, he strangles and kills the young guy. It seemed like he really enjoyed the part that came after the murder, when he had to deal with the victims' bodies, because similarly, he leaves the body in the basement for what I imagine is decomposing time, and he does the same thing to it. But even this time, the skull ends up breaking. It's now March 1988. He would still constantly go out trying to meet new people, and on the 24th, he meets a 22-year-old and offers him $50 to come hang out with him. They go back to his place where he drugs him, strangles him, performs sexual acts with the body, but decides not to keep the skull this time since he didn't find the victim attractive enough. About a month later, on April 23rd, he picked another victim, brought him to his home, drugged him, but a few moments before he was about to kill him, his grandma comes back to the house and calls down at him. "Jeffrey, do you have a friend over?" Stuck and not wanting to get caught, Jeffrey sneaks the boy out of the bag, throws him in the back seat, and dumps him at the county hospital. A few months later, on September 1988, his grandma finally breaks the news to him that she wanted him to move out. She couldn't stand the smells that were coming from the basement and didn't like the fact that Jeffrey had so many people over at night. Jeffrey reluctantly agrees and moves out by the end of the month. Not even 1 day later, he gets caught drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old. He gets arrested, and if you thought he would go to jail and all this would be over, you thought wrong. He was only convicted of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral reasons. And his sentencing? 5 years probation and forced to be registered as a sex offender. This still seemed to not affect him one bit. His grandma tried to help him by letting him move back with her, but only weeks later, he kills another young man. He was a 25-year-old model that Jeffrey found exceptionally attractive. He murdered him the same way he did his previous victims, but took it a step further by bringing the body upstairs to the bathtub and chopping it up there. Since he found this victim so attractive, he decides to keep some of his body parts: the head, the lower region, including the penis, and preserving them in acetone. On May 1990, he finally moves into his own apartment. It was an old building in a high-crime area of town, but he didn't mind. It even worked out to his advantage, finding his victims easier and hiding his crimes better. Shortly after, he drugged and murdered his sixth victim. This is when he starts to also take pictures of bodies in suggestive positions and when separating them into pieces. He also started spray painting the skulls and adding them to his collection on top of his metal cabinet. His seventh victim was on June 1990. His eighth was a 22-year-old man he met at a bar. He offered him $50 to hang out, but when they went to his place, Jeffrey wanted to engage in sexual acts. When the victim asked for more money, Jeffrey got pissed. And since he didn't have enough pills, he decided to just cut his throat. He takes pictures of the body, separates it, and keeps some parts for later consumption. He paints the skull and adds it to his collection. On September 24th, he killed his eighth victim. A few months pass until he decides to kill again. He sees a young guy on his way to the store to get his key cut. They start chatting, so he invites him over. At his house, he drugs the guy and decides to try something different. This time, he digs a hole in his skull and pours hydrochloric acid in it. Why, you may ask? He wanted to create sort of a zombie, someone he didn't have to kill, but would be passive enough for him to do whatever he wants and the victim wouldn't complain. He wanted to induce a permanent submissive state. The boy ends up waking up, confused, asking Jeffrey what happened. Jeffrey, now annoyed that he woke up, ends up strangling him. And he really wanted to keep the skull since it was the first one with a hole in it, but ends up breaking it, so of course he wanted another one. It was now a few months later, 1991. Jeffrey was continuing living his life until one day his neighbors started complaining of the smell and the sounds coming from his apartment. They said that it would smell foul all the time, and at night they would hear construction sounds from his apartment, chopping, drilling sounds. So they called the building manager and told him their concerns. The building manager calls Jeffrey up, but Jeffrey said that his freezer broke. That's why it was smelling so bad. The manager says, "All right, just get it fixed. I don't want to hear any more complaints." Weeks go by, and the manager has to call again due to even more complaints from the neighbors. This time, Jeffrey decides to say that his fancy fish had died. That's why it was smelling. Again, the building manager decides to just say, "Fix it. I don't want to have to come up there," and he never did, unfortunately. Who knows what would have happened if the manager had shown up. Shortly after, on May 26th, if you'll notice, things are happening more quickly now. Some say that Jeffrey had a feeling he was going to get caught. He meets a 14-year-old and offers him money for him to come hang out with him. The boy was reluctant, but he ended up going to Jeffrey's apartment. There, he drugs him, digs a hole in his skull, and pours acid, same as the previous victim. This time, the victim was unconscious for a while, so Jeffrey leaves to go get drinks at the store, but when he came back, the boy was outside, naked, and 3 young women were asking if it was okay. Luckily, they had called 911 before Jeffrey got there, so when he was trying to sweet-talk them and trying to get his way out of the situation by saying that it was just his drunk boyfriend, the police arrived, and they also persisted not letting Jeffrey leave with the boy. One of the women even pulled the police aside and explained to them that the guy was bleeding from his behind and was fighting Jeffrey to not have to go upstairs with him. But the officers seemed to immediately believe Jeffrey and fall for his charisma, and they told the women, "Butt out and not interfere," which is insane to me. The women pushed and pushed until they couldn't anymore, so Jeffrey ends up going back upstairs with the boy, where he injects acid again into him, and the victim dies. Jeffrey decided to take his time with the body this time. So he calls his job and tells them that he won't show up tomorrow. He has something to do. In the following weeks, he killed 3 more people and took off work every time, so he ended up getting fired from his job. Again, that didn't teach him anything, so he ended up killing 1 more, just in a form of protest against being fired from the job, for doing what he liked, chopping up bodies. It was now July 22nd, 1991. He was out and about and he approaches 3 men, offering them $100 for them to come over and let him take pictures of them naked and have drinks while doing so. 2 of them immediately said no, but 1 of them agreed, needing money at the time. They walk into his apartment, and while the victim was looking around, he got suspicious of the boxes and barrels of acid that were laying around Jeffrey's apartment. Jeffrey tells him that he was just cleaning his floors, and that's why there's so much acid around and it smells like it too. So they're hanging out, and Jeffrey pulls a knife at him, saying he was going to rip his heart out. The guy freaks out and immediately started making a plan to leave that place. He was really worried for his safety. He asks Jeffrey if he could go to the bathroom, looks around but doesn't really find any exit, so steps outside of the bathroom. Then takes a few more moments and asks Jeffrey if he could go to the bathroom again. This time, when Jeffrey wasn't paying attention, he comes out of the bathroom and punches him and runs. While running down the street, he sees two cops. He flags them down and explains to them what had happened. As proof, he shows them a handcuff that he had around his wrist. Luckily, the other side wasn't attached to anything, otherwise he wouldn't be able to run. And he said that this guy, speaking of Jeffrey, had attached his handcuff on him, and just the whole situation was so weird, and asked for their help to go back. He was feeling comfortable going back with the officers, and they figured, let's just go back and just help this guy get his handcuff off, if anything. They go to Jeffrey's apartment and knock. Jeffrey answers, a little nervous, but seemingly calm, thinking that his charisma would get him out of this as well. And the police ask him for the keys to the handcuffs. They had tried their keys, but since it was an off-brand one, it didn't work, so they needed the specific keys for it. Jeffrey says, oh, it's just back in my room, I'll go get it. And one of the officers wanted to go with him. Jeffrey, now nervous, tries to block the way so the cop didn't really see what was happening with his boxes, but he pushed through, the officer that is, and makes his way to Jeffrey's bedroom. To my understanding, Jeffrey was hanging out in the living room at this point with the guy and the other officer. And when the cop that was in the bedroom retrieving the keys turns around, he catches a glimpse of Jeffrey's closet. There he sees all these Polaroids, and when looking closer, he notices that on them is dead bodies, parts of dead bodies, and just bodies in sexual inappropriate positions. And when taking another look at them, he notices that they're all in the apartment when he's currently at. He calls the other officer, and now Jeffrey, realizing what had happened, starts getting defensive and fighting arrest. Because of course, they tried to arrest him right away. The cops call for backup because Jeffrey was a tall dude and not really easy to fight. And when the backup arrives, they start searching the apartment. They found a severed head in the freezer and human parts everywhere. It's at least reported there were 4 severed heads in the kitchen, 7 skulls, 2 hearts, a torso, and human insides in the freezer. Who knows what else was all around the place. I can't imagine what those officers went through. He was finally arrested and taken to jail after all this. On July 23rd, 1991, so next day, he was brought in for questioning. And this time, Jeffrey admits to murdering 16 young men since 1987. On January 30th, 1992, so about 6-7 months later, trial begins for 15 counts first-degree murder. The whole trial lasted for 2 weeks. In the end, Jeffrey was given life imprisonment plus 70 years. For the first year of his life in prison, they had to place him in solitary confinement for his safety because he was getting multiple threats from the other inmates. On November 28, 1994, he was found on the floor of the bathrooms of the gym with extreme head and facial wounds. What had happened? He had been beat in the head with a 20-inch metal bar, and his face was slammed against the wall. The prison officers had rushed him to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. When they asked the inmate who did it why, he said, "God told me to do it," and said Jeffrey didn't fight him back. According to the psychologist mentioned before, he said that Jeffrey had given up. The shame had just overtaken him. Jeffrey's mother died in 2000. His father wrote a book about his experience with Jeffrey, and his brother, remember he had a younger brother, ends up changing his last name because he wanted nothing to do with it. This was it for today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for sticking by it. If you're listening right now, I appreciate you. And I will see you in the next video with another crazy story. Bye, and be safe out there.